He's a man of integrity, a man of principle, and a man of total, utter resolve. Jeff understands that the job of Attorney General is to serve and protect the people of the United States. And that is exactly what he will do, and do better than anybody else can.
It is an honor beyond words to serve under you and your leadership. I look forward to making sure that every ounce of strength I have and that the people of the Department of Justice have is going to be focused on preserving and protecting the Constitution and the safety of this country.
It's like looking at that happy first date photo of a couple that now regularly fights in public. Donald Trump today is once again dragging his attorney general through the mud, unleashing a new round of attacks against a person he could fire whenever he wanted to. He told The Hill TV, quote, "I don't have an attorney general. It's very sad. I'm not happy at the border. I'm not happy with numerous things. Not just this. I'm so sad over..." I'm sorry. I'm so sad over Jeff Sessions because he came to me. He was the first senator that endorsed me, and he wanted to be attorney general, and I didn't see it. Trump was asked about that "I don't have an attorney general" comment, I guess in case any of us worry, when he was standing in front of Marine One this morning and insisted that we take it seriously, not literally.
I'm disappointed in the Attorney General for numerous reasons, but we have an Attorney General. I'm disappointed in the Attorney General for many reasons, and you understand.
Are you going to fire him? Are you going to fire Jeff Sessions?
We are looking at lots of different things. I have a great cabinet. We have the greatest economy ever in the history of our country. So we're very happy with the way things are running, generally speaking. I don't think we've ever had an economy like this. Somebody who's on just this morning from Reagan, from the Reagan White House, he said this is one of the great economies in history. So we're very happy.
Joining us now is former U.S. Attorney, now an MSNBC contributor, Barbara McQuade, and from the Washington Post, Associate Editor and columnist Eugene Robinson. David, Zerlina, and Jonathan are all still here. Barbara McQuade, I have to start with you because it seems like a president that likes to talk about things that are big and strong looks like such a wuss that he doesn't just fire this guy whose guts he hates.
Yeah, I think to use your first date analogy, I think he's sort of like, the boyfriend who, if he's mean enough to you, you'll just break up with him because, and quit. I think this is a strategy to encourage Jeff Sessions, a man of honor, a gentleman, to quit if he is abused enough, because if he quits, then the president, no doubt, can use the Vacancies Reform Act. If he fires him, there's some question as to whether he can do that. And so he can put his own person in there temporarily for a period of 7 months to be the acting attorney general. And during those 7 months, he could do a lot of things. He could fire Robert Mueller because the acting attorney general would no longer be recused. And so I think if he shames Jeff Sessions enough, if he declassifies things, maybe he can play a game of chicken with him and get him to the point where he resigns.
Let me play a little bit of something that my friend and colleague Rachel Maddow spoke to former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton about last night that picks up on your point, Barbara.
What I worry about, Rachel, is that after this election, this president's going to wholesale fire people. That's my prediction for tonight, okay. Like my prediction from last year. And if we don't have one or both houses of Congress in place, he will be even more uncontrollable and unaccountable. He will fire people in the White House. He will fire people in his administration who he thinks are crossing him, questioning him, undermining him.
Eugene, I want to bring you in on this because there's something sort of glib and ludicrous and the date analysis and the idea that he's so petty, he's bullying a cabinet secretary. But there is a much more serious part of this conversation that Barbara and Secretary Clinton both lead us toward. And that is this idea of obstructing justice in plain sight, which is what these firings all have in common. And this interview with The Hill TV is remarkable for the fact that it's so unremarkable that he still talks publicly about wanting his Justice Department and his FBI to basically, as Jonathan and I were talking about, serve as his personal bouncers. What do you make of sort of the state of vitriol toward his own Attorney General, his own law enforcement agencies, his own Justice Department?
Well, Nicole, I guess I'll leave aside the fact that it makes me sad too, just like the president.
Right?
I mean, this is ridiculous on one level, as you point out. This is a man he could fire anytime he wants. But I actually think Hillary Clinton is absolutely right. I think he will not fire Jeff Sessions before the election, though he would like to, but he won't because of the political ramifications and the fact that would hurt Republicans' chances of keeping both houses of Congress. And afterwards, win or lose, I think he will fire Jeff Sessions because I think he wants an attorney general, his attorney general, who will be his bouncer, but at the velvet ropes, protecting him, not, as he said when naming Sessions, not protecting the United States, but protecting him. I think that's what he wants. And whether or not that person goes all the way and fires Rosenstein and Mueller and shuts the investigation down to the extent that he or she can, I don't know. But I think at the very least the idea would be to control it, to oversee it in a way that keeps it from harming the president. If all else fails, to keep secret parts of the Mueller's findings that really should be shared with the American people, and that Rosenstein and Sessions probably will make public, but that a new attorney general might not.
David Jolly, anyone that would do what Eugene just described could not be confirmed, and anyone that could be confirmed would not do what Eugene just described.
No, and in President Trump's comment that he does not have an attorney general, what he means is he does not have an attorney general that the president feels is sufficiently insulating and protecting himself, Donald Trump, as president. He does have an attorney general that has successfully advanced Donald Trump's criminal justice policies, and frankly, just as Trump wanted to do, rolled back much of President Obama's criminal justice policies. So the attorney general of the United States is actually doing what the president suggested he wanted done, but he is stopping short of protecting Donald Trump himself. What the president means when he says he doesn't have an attorney general is the attorney general is not his personal lawyer, and Donald Trump wants him to be his personal lawyer. And to your point, Nicole, a person who pledges that type of loyalty should never be confirmed by the United States Senate.
And they wouldn't be, Jonathan Lemire, but he's going so far as to smear Jeff Sessions in really personal terms. He went on to say in this interview about Sessions, he went through the nominating process and he did very poorly. I mean, he was mixed up and confused. God, I follow Trump on Twitter. I feel like that's projection. People that worked with him for, a long time in the Senate were not nice to him, but he was giving very confusing answers that should have been easily answered, and that was a rough time for him. But on the other hand, he sort of has a point. We watched that today. Let's watch that again.
I had no recollection of this meeting until I saw these news reports.
Did anyone else at that meeting, including then-candidate Trump, react in any way to what Mr. Papadopoulos had presented?
I don't recall.
Did you discuss your meetings with Ambassador Kislyak with Mr. Flynn?
I do not recall and don't believe I communicated any of that information.
Did anybody ever forward to you a communication from Mr. Papadopoulos?
I don't recall it. I don't recall ever being made aware of that before. I don't recall it. I do not recall such a conversation. I don't recall it.
In your testimony today, you have stated, I don't recall, at least 20 times. Is that fair to say?
I have no idea.
I'm going to mark this day on my calendar, the day I agreed with Donald Trump, who said answers that should have been easily answered. I mean, he's got a point, and what they all have in common is they were all about Russia.
Right. I believe it's been reported that Trump has referred to Jeff Sessions as Mr. Magoo.
Right.
And we're seeing that on display in that pretty tough video clip there. Yes, they are all about Russia. But what has happened here over the last few months is a sort of a blockade had been formed around Jeff Sessions, protecting him, where there are Republican senators who said he was a valuable former colleague and deserves your loyalty. Don't fire him. We can't confirm anybody else. There are conservatives who said, like, hey, he's actually getting your agenda done. He's probably been your most effective cabinet member, enacting the MAGA agenda in the DOJ. And also the people who have
Oh, I just got like a stomach flip. The MAGA agenda in DOJ.
Sorry about that. And then, of course, there are some counselors that come as close advisors, including Rudy Giuliani, who say to him, like, if you fire him now, that's only going to make the Russia probe worse.
Well, they're going to say you'll get impeached.
Right. Don't do this. But what we have seen, though, is Lindsey Graham was sort of the first really to step out a few weeks ago and give Trump cover, suggesting that, yes, you should wait till the midterms are over because this would be politically dangerous for the Republican Party, but suggesting that, hey, the president deserves to have an attorney general he trusts, that he has confidence in. And I think that there's a widely held expectation in Washington. Sessions isn't going to quit. He's told people around him he's not going to walk away. But at some point, whether it's November or December, January, the Trump will fire him, and then the dominoes will fall as they may.
Barbara McQuade, this idea of sort of normalizing the venom against Jeff Sessions will be one of the black marks on Lindsey Graham's legacy in the Senate. But take me inside what happens next, which is my 6-year-old's favorite question. So he fires Sessions the morning after the midterms. What happens next? Who takes that job, and what do they have to promise Trump to get it?
Yeah, well, you talked about, anyone who would do the things that President Trump would want him to do, and the Russia investigation, for example, could not be confirmed. But if he acts under the Vacancies Reform Act for a temporary position, he could appoint someone for up to 7 months in an acting capacity. It has to be someone who's already presidentially confirmed, but it could be somebody in the Justice Department or any other part of the executive branch who could come in for those 7 months and do his bidding. That person would not have to be confirmed. And so that's what I worry about. This is a person who has not had to go before the Senate and go through the scrutiny and make promises about what he may or may not do with regard to the Russia investigation. That person could come in, shut it down, or I think more subtly, make decisions to clip the wings of Robert Mueller that never see the light of day, not allowing him to take certain investigative steps, for example, or indict certain individuals. And so I think that is a way to seize control of over the Russia investigation.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.